No one in the small town of Red Willow had ever seen old Hank Turner frightened, not once. Not when a wildfire raged over the ridge, not when a rattlesnake curled itself under his porch, not even when he lost nearly all his cattle in the Great Freeze of '09. Hank was the kind of man who walked steady through storms. But on one cold autumn evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and the wind scratched at the windows, he opened his front door and found 7 widows standing in a row on his porch, exhausted, shivering, and each one looking at him with eyes full of sorrow and hope. What happened next would change Hank's life and the whole town forever. Before we begin, if you love heartwarming stories about humanity, kindness, and real-life miracles, make sure to subscribe to Soul Tales. Don't forget to like the video, leave a comment, and share your thoughts. Your support helps us bring more inspiring stories to life. Hank Turner lived alone on a ranch nearly a mile outside Red Willow, a quiet town tucked between the Colorado foothills and endless golden plains. He was 65, tall and rugged, with hands that looked like they'd been carved straight from tree bark. People often said you could read the entire history of the West in the lines of his face. Hank didn't mind the quiet. After losing his wife, Marlene, 10 years earlier, silence had become a companion. His life followed a simple rhythm: sunrise coffee, tending to the horses, checking the fences, patching whatever needed patching, then ending each day beside the old wood stove with a cup of tea. He didn't expect surprises anymore. Life rarely delivered them at his age. But one late October evening, as the sky turned a dusty purple, Hank noticed a line of headlights inching up his long dirt driveway. That alone was strange. No one drove this way unless they needed something. Hank rose from his chair, slipped into his coat, and stepped out onto the porch. The headlights flicked off. Truck doors opened. And then he saw them. 7 women, all older, all weary, walking toward him in a tight group. They were dressed warmly, but the wind still cut through them like a blade. The woman in front, a silver-haired lady with gentle eyes and a cane, stepped forward. "Sir, we're so sorry to bother you," she began, her voice shaking. "We're on our way to a retreat in the mountains, a place for widows like us, but the road washed out behind us. We don't have anywhere to stay tonight." Hank looked at them. Their cheeks were flushed from the cold. One woman's hands trembled uncontrollably. Another looked like she had been crying for miles. "Please," the eldest whispered, "just one night. We'll be gone by sunrise." Hank swallowed. His house wasn't prepared for guests. He hadn't had company in years, not since Marlene passed. The idea of 7 strangers inside his quiet home unsettled him. But then he remembered something his wife used to say: "If someone comes to your door in need, let them in. God sends people for a reason." He stepped aside, tipping his hat. "Well," he said softly, "you ladies better get inside before the wind decides to take one of you." The women sighed with relief and hurried in. Inside, Hank's house felt warm but old. The wooden floors creaked, and the place smelled faintly of pine and worn leather. He cleared off the big dining table, fetched extra blankets, and even pulled out Marlene's old quilts that he kept in a cedar chest. The widows thanked him over and over. One even grabbed his hand with both of hers, tears in her eyes. Hank cooked a big pot of stew, though he usually ate something much simpler. As the aroma filled the house, the women introduced themselves: Evelyn, Ruth, Margaret, Alma, Joyce, Lillian, and Doris. Each had a story. Each had known deep love and deep loss. After dinner, they gathered around the fireplace. At first, everyone sat stiffly, unsure how to act. Hank wasn't much of a talker, and the widows didn't want to impose, but the firelight softened the room, and slowly, the stories began to flow like warm water. Evelyn talked about her husband, Frank, who had been a farmer for 40 years. Ruth shared that she'd been married to a truck driver who wrote her love letters from every state. Alma described how her husband used to dance with her in the kitchen every Friday night. Hank listened quietly, nodding, offering refills of tea, and occasionally smiling at their memories. He rarely spoke, but when he mentioned Marlene, how she'd been the only woman he ever danced with, every widow looked at him with tender understanding. For the first time in years, Hank felt something inside him loosen. The silence he had wrapped around himself began to crack. Later that night, when everyone had gone to bed in the guest rooms and the living room couches, Hank stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the empty stew pot. The house felt strangely alive, with warmth, with voices, with laughter he hadn't realized he missed. He whispered into the quiet, "Marlene, what do you think of this?" The wind whistled outside, but inside, Hank felt peace. The next morning, Hank woke early, expecting the widows to be preparing to leave. But when he stepped outside, he saw the mountain road still completely blocked by mud and fallen trees. It would take at least another day, maybe longer, to clear. When he told the women, they looked anxious, embarrassed, apologetic. "We don't want to be a burden," Joyce said. "You're not," Hank replied firmly. "You stay as long as you need to." And so they did. Over the next 2 days, something remarkable happened on Hank's ranch. The widows, instead of sitting around feeling helpless, began to help Hank with chores. Lillian swept the porch, Margaret cooked breakfast every morning. Alma scrubbed his old kitchen counters until they shined. Evelyn even stitched up a ripped saddle blanket with needle and thread. "This place just needs a woman's touch," she said, smiling. Hank chuckled. 7 women's touch, from the looks of it. They laughed, and the sound echoed across the fields. But it wasn't just chores. There was comfort, too. Ruth would sit on the porch with Hank every evening, talking softly about life, about loss, about starting over even when you think you're too old for new beginnings. "You know," she told him once, "sometimes kindness finds us when we've stopped looking for it." Hank didn't respond, but the words sank deep. On the 4th morning, the road was finally clear. The widows packed their bags, preparing to continue to their retreat. A heavy feeling settled in Hank's chest as he watched them line up near the porch, the same way they had 4 nights earlier. But this time, their faces were bright, filled with gratitude rather than fear. Evelyn stepped forward. "You saved us, Hank. In more ways than one. We won't forget your kindness." "No, ma'am," he replied softly. "You saved me too." Margaret handed him a small, folded paper. "Open it after we leave," she said. The women hugged him one by one, and Hank felt tears burning the corners of his eyes. As they drove off, Hank stood alone on the porch, watching the dust settle. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. Strangely, he felt connected. When he finally unfolded the piece of paper Margaret had given him, he found it filled with handwritten messages from all 7 widows. Words of thanks, words of blessing. At the bottom, Margaret had written, "Kindness is never small, Hank. Sometimes it changes the giver more than the receiver." Hank pressed the note to his chest and closed his eyes. That winter, Hank made a decision. He opened his ranch once a month to host community dinners, free to anyone who needed warmth or company. Some months only 3 people showed up. Other months 20 came. But every month Hank cooked, cleaned, and opened his door just like he had for the widows. And every year, on the anniversary of that cold October night, Hank received 7 handwritten letters, one from each widow, thanking him again, reminding him that love and kindness still lived in the world. Hank used to think his life had ended when Marlene died. But the truth was, it had simply gone quiet. And sometimes it takes a knock on the door, 7 knocks in his case, to wake a heart back up. In a world where people often pass by each other without a second glance, Hank learned that kindness isn't something you give only when it's convenient. It's something you choose, especially when it feels uncomfortable, unexpected, or inconvenient. And sometimes, the smallest act of opening your door can open your heart too. So let this story be a reminder. Kindness doesn't cost much, but its impact lasts a lifetime. You never know whose life you might change, or how your own might change in return.